Henry of Skallitz. The first appearance of this name can be traced to the records of Sasau Monastery, dating to the year of our Lord 1403, after the sacking of Silver Skallitz by Sigismund of Hungary, during that tumultuous period when many high nobles were vying for the Bohemian throne. He seems to have come to some local renown through aiding some minor lords in their efforts to quell the banditry plaguing the county.
Well, I figured if Wolflin was dead, his gang would disband, so I killed him.
Jesus Christ! Are you mad, Henry? You went there on your own?
Yes.
Right. Well...
But strangely, multiple people with the same name also make appearances in the records of this time. There's one Henry, Huntsmaster of Taunberg, who resolved the long-standing criminal accusations against the previous Huntsmaster.
There's one obvious candidate. Henry here. Help me bring Nicholas to justice. And he's no disgrace as a hunter.
Good. Then I hereby name you Master Huntsman at Taunberg Castle.
And another Henry was appointed bailiff of the village of Troskowitz to oversee its reconstruction.
Henry, I hereby appoint you to the office of bailiff of the hamlet of Troskowitz in my domain.
Me? But Marius said it would cost a fortune.
True.
And yet another Henry is known for his involvement with local crime gangs by engaging in crimes such as theft.
I want to know whether you're going to hide behind some stupid fucking scruples, or if you might be useful for more unconventional work.
And the distribution of herbal remedies of dubious quality.
Is nothing sacred to you?
Money first, morals later.
But given the implausibility that a single individual could possibly do all that in such a short time span, we must chalk it up to simple coincidence that multiple Henrys were prominent at the same time.
Judging by that ugly gob, you must be Henry.
Sirs, you aren't the first to mix me up with this Henry fellow.
What is clear though, is that one Henry of Skallitz was indeed involved in the siege of Taunberg. He proved himself critical to the construction of a trebuchet, which the records say was used by the lord of the castle to bombard his own fortress. It seems far-fetched, but perhaps this is an error that crept into the record as it was copied by the monks over the centuries.
Oh no, such a waste of parchment. How could you?
But we only know of this minor event because Margrave Jobst is known to have counseled with the local lords at around this time. There are no records of this meeting, but we may surmise that it was yet more of the scheming the Margrave was well known for.
Well, I'd also venture to suggest one more. What is their stance on that is, the initiatives of Margrave Jobst of Moravia and a large part of the Bohemian nobility? Whether they plan to take action against them or support their efforts?
You read my thoughts, sir.
It is known, however, that a small legation set off after towards Trosky Castle, which provides evidence that the Margrave wished to parley with Otto von Berghoff. It is at this point that the records of Henry of Skallitz become more reliable, and in these volumes we shall endeavour to present a just and true narrative of his actions henceforth.
Audentes fortuna juvat!
Hello! Welcome to the start of the KCD2 series. For those who haven't seen it, this is a continuation of the Did You Know series covering the first KCD game, but now obviously covering the second game. The focus will be on highlighting the different hidden aspects of the game. So we're talking about showing you things like the hidden options in quests, and the consequences, optional interactions, and missable conversations. In other words, the secrets of the game. As always, I play in hardcore mode with all negative perks, but I also add a few house rules to make things more realistic. The first one limits how much I can raise my combat skills via training. All combat skills are capped at 10 until we leave the first map, 15 until we restore the guild, and unlimited afterwards. Natural increase through combat is fine. I just can't practice with the trainer after I hit the caps. This is to prevent Henry from unrealistically becoming the best warrior ever at the start of the game. And from a role-playing perspective, this also fits well with Henry's shoulder injury. You can imagine that it takes some time to fully recover. But these combat skills also limit what armor we can wear. So up to 10 warfare, we can only wear clothing or padded armor. Up to 15 we can wear mail and brigandine, and after that anything. What this means is that even well into the game, we'll be using a lot of armor that most people would ignore in favor of plate. But outside of major pitched battles, we also have to wear practical armor. That's because wearing full plate is cumbersome and it takes time to put on. So we can wear things like brigandine or a breastplate, but we can't go around in full plate all the time. We also can't loot clothing or armor from bodies, because in real life that would take time. And everything we wear, except for unique items, has to be purchased from a store to simulate the need to tailor it to our size. This means that we'll have less money overall, and it will be more costly to get good gear. So essentially we're slowing ourselves down. I will also not be using the set system, and I can't change clothing on the fly, because again, you just can't put on and take off clothing. So that means I have to compromise between different needs when choosing what to wear. All of this keeps things more realistic. But overarching all this will be a role-playing focus. I hope you like it. Lord Capen's party arrived in the vicinity of Trosky Castle a few weeks after setting off.
Halt! What are you after here?
But they were welcomed, if that's the right word, by a patrol from the castle led by the captain of the garrison. It was a tense standoff.
Lord Hanush of Lipa is on the side of King Wenceslas, while my master is a member of the League of Lords. So it would appear we are enemies.
And it was only through Henry's timely intervention that unfortunate conflict was avoided.
We're not enemies. We're carrying a message with the aim of putting a stop to the hostilities.
And who are you?
Henry, from Skallitz.
Henry's come to see us.
I'm Lord Capen's advisor and scribe.
Yes, it was only a few weeks ago that he'd learned his letters, but now he could proudly boast of his advanced learning.
Congratulations! You can go and be ordained right away.
So why should I trust you?
We want to resolve conflicts, not to stir up more. Once more, I assure you we have no evil intentions.
Very well.
He'd gone through a lot since the sacking of Skallitz. Enough that he was finally beginning to understand the wisdom of Martin's advice.
You might win a fight with violence, but you'll never win an argument. Remember, Henry, if you want to convince someone that they're wrong, try using your mouth and not your fists.
But sadly, Lord Capen was still far behind Henry when it came to learning from experience.
They're probably keeping their heads down, what with that big patrol combing the woods for them.
They found a dice table in a small cave behind the campsite, and Henry happened to find a special die there. Henry's instincts told him that that chest would be a good place to stash some valuables to retrieve later, should anything go wrong at Trosky. But surely nothing could. Had Hans shared Henry's sense of foresight, they would have camped in a less open space.
Oh, don't be such an old woman, Oates. Bring some wine to warm our blood.
But the young sir still had much to learn. Perhaps he'd mature in a few years.
Ah, Christ. Will I ever live to see his young lordship finally grow up?
Females!
Or maybe a few centuries. But just this once, Lord Capen's capriciousness worked in their favour. Even if it did also result in their men getting killed. The Lord does indeed giveth and taketh away. To this day, scholars still debate about exactly what Henry thought he'd accomplish by shouting.
Hey! What the fuck are you doing?
Maybe the bandits take a few minutes to kill them before doing the dastardly deeds. But perhaps, just perhaps, they did help the laundry girls. As it was a close call, but desperation lent them fins. They were not unscathed though. Henry took a serious wound to the shoulder, and this would unfortunately limit his physical abilities for the next few weeks.
Wait!
But far worse was the fact that these bandits were no mere ragamuffins. They intended to leave no survivors.
They mustn't get away. Got that? Call out as soon as you see them. And then kill them. No fucking around. You, watch the middle of the gorge. And keep your eyes peeled, right? You two, go up there. Get a move on. You watch this side of the rocks. And you, go to the pond. If they didn't succeed in swimming to the other side of the pond, I want to know. Then come back and give me a full report. Footprints, blood trails, everything. Get to work. Footprints, blood trails,
see us.
everything.
We'll have to wait.
Do you honestly think
Get
they
to
could
work.
swim all the fucking way across?
Shut up. Keep moving.
It's still easier here than that skirmish on the other side.
Stumbling about in the pitch black when all your talk does is blind you.
Leave it out. Catching some naked men in the forest is better than getting killed in a skirmish.
Maybe. But I still can't see a bloody thing.
Ah, we'll fucking do them in and get a nice reward. Nothing to it.
I played dice against Lefty yesterday. Keep your watch instead. You reckon we'll find them, do you? If they come somewhere on the bed, why are we moving down instead of being high up? Because you can't see shit from up there through the foliage. But we were sent up top. There won't be nothing up there. So we're looking down here. You keep watch here, right? I'll go back a bit. We'll stay inside of each other. So nobody can squeeze through. Got it? Got it.
Eavesdropping on the conversation, it seemed that the leadership of this group was quite experienced in battle. But interestingly, the rank and file seemed to be of a less disciplined sort. Perhaps new recruits.
No. Fuck, they're in front of us. Quick, into the rocks.
Split up! Quiver! They're fleeing into the rocks! Hurry! Run around! Catch them at the top!
They barely managed to flee into a narrow gorge despite being spotted.
Hey? Hans! There's more of them up top!
They're here!
Take cover!
Run ahead of them!
But these bandits were persistent.
Go and look into that gorge behind me and see if there's a way forward. I'll stay here meanwhile and watch out for them.
Where are they? I don't know. They must have come this way, damn it. If only that bloody idiot Nails hadn't broken his leg climbing down the cliff. He was trying to catch up with him. Aye, but he shouldn't have jumped down in the dark. You keep watch here, and I'll go and push through. Give me a shout if you see them. Aye. When the others get here, we'll move in from both sides. And send someone after me too. Got it.
And only Henry's wits allowed him to get past them.
What's that?
Oh, this looks like a way out. Hans!
Here! Oh, God, we found each other. I didn't manage to warn you when those soldiers popped up in front of me. I only just avoided being seen. And I only found my way out of those bloody rocks a while ago.
And nearly got away with it too.
Would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids.
Woo! He said it! He said the line!
Back in Rattay, this poor bandit would have been quickly dispatched.
You're in for an arse kicking, you.
But his wounded shoulder betrayed him at the crucial moment.
For the love of God, wake up! Pull yourself together, Henry.
It was only through the grace of God, but somehow Henry survived the fall.
Oh, I thought you were done for.
And they slowly made their way through the feverish marsh.
Fuck! Bianca!
God save, my lovely. You're looking well today.
You too, handsome. What brings you here?
Your beauty, of course.
Oh, noble sir. I'm as honored as any simple maid can be.
Anything else in
Father!
the trunk? Go to the castle. Hurry. What about you?
Are you mad?
Mother is in the village. I'll fetch her and we'll follow right behind. I'll go with you. No. You do what I say right now. Give the sword to Sir Roger.
Christ's sake!
If anything happens, he'll take
Come
care of you.
on!
Can't run away.
Henry, pull yourself together.
I'll kill them.
Please. There's nobody here. You're just imagining things.
Run. No.
Don't give in to it. Hang in there.
Look.
Together.
The linden tree. Just like Father always wanted.
No, we can't stop.
And Pa, I let them all down.
You never let me down.
Until they stumbled on a lone hut.
Henry, a light. Look.
I see it.
We've got to go.
Pavlena, is it you?
Greetings, good wife. Fear not. We mean you no harm. My friend needs help. We were ambushed, but don't worry. We'll get you fixed up right as rain.
Now I've got you, whore sons.
Think again, strong!
Get up now. There's work to be done.
Mother?
I ain't your ma, laddie.
Yes, if only his ma was still with him.
Ma? Ma! I'm hurt. Won't stop bleeding.
Oh, now, stop squealing like a baby and show me that.
She would have made things better in a jiffy.
There you are, good as new. You ought to learn to do that yourself.
Thanks, Ma.
Slowly, lad. Slowly.
What about Hans?
He's taken care of for now, but he was on the edge there for a bit.
Thanks a lot. May God reward you 1,000-fold. What's your name, by the way?
Božena's my name.
Well, I'm Henry.
I'll go and check on him.
Henry was actually surprised to wake up the next morning. He was still alive. Very weak, but still alive. But back in the real world, Hans had nearly sacrificed his life.
Hans, can you hear me, friend? Christ. In the end, you bore the brunt for both of us. May all the saints watch over you. And over Bojana, too.
Oh.
Lord God Almighty, look down on a poor sinner and hear my heartfelt prayer. Protect Sir Hans and don't let him die. Just as he didn't let me die. Preserve his life. Because he's a young gentleman. Brave and just and a good Christian. And look down on Bojana too. And let her save Sir Hans. And deliver her from all evil. And grant her grace. Because she herself is merciful and didn't turn us away in our hour of need. Amen.
Amen. Now, first we have to deal with that fever. The best and fastest remedy for that is chamomile decoction. I'll be glad if you get back here soon. I don't feel right being here with that corpse in my yard.
Aside from the chamomile brew, there was also the small matter of a body lying in the shit pile. Just this one time Henry decided to wear these rags, no matter how ill-fitting and stinking they were. It was better than being naked.
This will be the weapon used by the bastard who cut up Sir Hans.
Henry decided that saving Hans was the more urgent matter. And of course his back was playing up again. His work as the distributor of medicinal herbal remedies in Rattay had taken a permanent toll. So he could drink a potion to bring himself back from the brink of death, but cure a bad back? That was too difficult apparently. Remember kids, learn from Henry's fate. Always bend your legs when picking things up off the ground. Yet when he returned, some ruffians were confronting Vagena.
Spit it out, crone. What fucking happened here, and how come Boris is dead?
It happened during the night. He fell off the cliff and broke his neck.
Don't try my temper, crone. It wasn't a broken neck that killed him. His head's caved in, and he bled like a stuck pig. Who killed him? Where's the one that done it? Start talking, or we'll torch this hovel with you inside it, you old witch.
All right, all right. Some young fellas came here at night and got into a fight with your man. What could I do? A weak old woman. They kill a fella outside my door, they threaten me, and now you want to burn my home down for it.
See now, that wasn't too hard, was it? It would have been easier if you told us the truth from the start. It's your own doing. And what happened then? Where's that pair? Talk or things will get nasty.
Well, one of them's lying inside, but he's got a fever. He won't be no use to you. He claims he's a noble, but that'll be the fever talking. He don't look like no lord.
Well, well, a noble, you say? Then you'd better get his lordship fixed up. Then we'll take him with us. You'll forget you ever saw him or us, and you'll keep the roof over your head. Get to it.
Yes, they knew the body's previous occupant, and were understandably a bit miffed.
I'll tear you a new arsehole, you...
Unfortunately, that left Vagena with no alternative but to tell the truth. And the only solution for Henry is to rush out and put them to the sword.
We're gonna gut you,
You're a dead man. You know that.
Bad luck.
Show what you're made of.
God in heaven, you look a sight. It's a wonder you're standing on your feet. My word, they worked you over good.
That's nothing but a scratch or two. You should see the other two fellas.
Don't play the hero. I can't see much, but I know what a battered fella looks like. Show me that. I'll try and get you into better shape. I didn't go to the trouble of healing you just so you'd up and die on me. Well now, better?
Much better.
So because he was lazy, he now had 3 bodies to dispose of instead of the one he started with. Well done, Henry.
Except I have 2 fresh corpses in my yard.
Don't worry. I reckon I've still got a bit of strength left. I ought to be able to manage it before evening.
Lord of Rattay.
Our king is locked up.
Yes.
But as I say, that's not how it happened. What happened is that Henry went and buried the body on the shit pile before he went for the herbs.
May the earth rest lightly on you, you bastard. I hope you find peace. And don't come out to haunt anyone. Well done. I got rid of that corpse for you.
God bless you, Henry. Thank you kindly. I'll sleep easier now, and when Ignatius the Gravedigger comes by, I'll get him to take care of the rest. You're going to need all the saints watching over you, and the Holy Virgin and all. Better pray you have someone up there looking out for you.
And thus, Bojena was able to get away with a lie.
Looking for those renegades who've been pillaging around the domain. They slaughtered some knight and his company yesterday down by the pond. 2 of them fled and they must be hiding here somewhere in the rocks. What do you know about it?
And who are you, fellas?
We're from Lord von Berghoff, and we're looking for those murderers.
I know Lord von Burgo's people, and I ain't never seen you before.
Lord von Burgov is reinforcing his garrison on account of them renegades that are wandering around here. We're new.
Oh, shouldn't all his people have Waffenrocks and shields with his colours?
For Christ's sake, woman, stop annoying me with your endless fucking questions. I'm the one asking the questions. And when I say we're from Burgov, then we're from fucking Burgov. Tell me, how come there's all these bloody rags here, eh? Spit it out. The blood's not even dry.
I was treating two fellas from Sheleoth, what got badly beaten up in a brawl in the tavern there yesterday.
Now, isn't that a coincidence? Right at the time when we're looking for two battered murderers around here. Out with the truth, you old hag, or we'll torch the whole place under your feet.
I'm telling you the truth. I treated them and they went on their way. Go and ask in Sheleoth about them.
We'll see about that. Now move! I'll have a look inside.
Better not go in there. There's a fellow from Tachov lying there with dysentery. Unless you'd like to be lying for weeks in a pool of bloody mucus that's coming out of you both ends at once.
Oh, boy! All right then, we'll skip the search. But if you're lying, there'll be hell to pay. Cosley, you keep watch over there. I'll have a little look around.
Not a very convincing one, but apparently the bandits were familiar with dysentery and its fragrant results.
Lord von Burgov sent us to find the renegades who ambushed some knights' company down by the pond yesterday. A couple of them fled and are hiding out here in the rocks. So tell me who you are and what you know about it.
You're from Lord von Burgov? You don't look like it.
Kurva! Watch your tongue with me, boy. When I say we're from von Burgov, then we're from fucking von Burgov. Who else would we be from anyway? You can talk to me or talk to cold steel. Who the hell are you? And what are you doing here?
But Henry was a careful listener. He'd noted that these fellows were very sensitive to any mention of Trosky guards. And thus, through a clever understanding of the enemy, Henry was able to fool them.
I'm Pavel, and I'm here to help Bozhena. I don't know anything about any attack, but I met some of von Burgov's men in the woods too. They had his shields and Waffenrocks. They were looking for some cutthroats. I gave them directions here, so you can join them once they get here.
Fuck.
What's the matter?
Nothing, fuck it. Just tell them we'll wait for them in the tavern in Sheleoth.
Killing them may have been the cleaner approach, but that was likely to bring more bandits to investigate. And the next time, they might not have been so kind as to ask questions first.
Devil take it. That's all I need. Getting mixed up in all sorts of nonsense at my age. They came here saying they was from Lord von Burgo, and they was looking for two bandits that ambushed some knight yesterday. But for sure they wasn't von Burgo's people. They didn't even have his Waffenrocks. But they sure sounded keen to find you fellas.
Maybe they were from that band that followed us yesterday.
Look here. I almost got slaughtered twice in one day on account of you two. God be praised that my Pavlena wasn't here. Heaven knows what they'd have done to her. So, I'd like to know why all this is happening. Your friend was talking in a delirium in the night, saying you was knights. But if you two are knights, then I'm the Queen of Sheba.
Sir Hans is the young lord of Leiper and Perkstein. I'm Henry of Skallitz, son of Sir Radzig Kobyla, and I'm his bodyguard. We were heading to Trosky to deliver a message from Sir Hanush of Leiper and Margrave Jobst to Lord von Burgov. But we were ambushed by bandits yesterday down by the pond, and you already know the rest. And as God is my witness, we're no bandits. I swear to you. I'm thankful to you for saving us. And I'm sorry it caused you trouble.
Well, you sound sincere, so I'll take your word for it. I hope I won't live to regret it.
You won't. I promise you.
Promises are made to be broken, but thank you for dealing with them.
What about Sir Hans?
He's holding up, I'd say. But what he needs most now is that remedy.
Seems Bozhena isn't some quack. She's got a damn good setup here.
Well, now, judging by the smell, I'd say you brewed it perfectly.
And thus it was that Henry saved Hans from the Grim Reaper.
With a bit of luck, that decoction will chase away the fever. You'll sleep better after, and that'll give you strength. There's not much more I can do now. It's up to you and the Almighty. The fever should start to cool now.
All this thinking had made Henry hungry again. But thankfully, he was able to use his hunting knowledge to find some forest mushrooms away down the path towards the pond. These were delicious once cooked. He was reminded of the lean times after the sack of Skallitz, when he'd refused to steal and found himself homeless.
That was a pretty speech, but you're still talking about a filthy deed. I won't do it. I value my honour higher than coin.
Henry still remembered how innocent he'd been back then, before the millers had forced him into a life of thievery. But it was also true that those skills had served him well, when put to more Christian purposes.
You're a dab hand, Hal. Make something out of you yet.
And the same went for alchemy. Henry thought to himself as he crafted some extra chamomile decoctions for his own use. The same skills could be used to make poisons and healing decoctions. Ultimately, it was the man using them that determined whether those skills were good or evil. That was a lesson he'd learnt well. And once again he was racked by nightmares.
Wake up, Henry. It's past sunrise.
But unfortunately it wasn't Ma.
Hallelujah. I thought you'd never wake.
She was truly gone.
Were you having a nightmare?
You must be Pavlena, right?
That's right. I came in the evening while you were asleep.
Hans, how is he?
He's alive, all right. Maybe too alive. Since he came to this morning, he hasn't stopped talking. But I heard you yelling in your sleep and went to check on you. Bad dreams? Dreams shouldn't be taken lightly. They can have real meaning. What strikes you as the most important part of your dream?
Pa, without a doubt. I hope his soul and Ma's find peace.
Dreaming of a dead parent is confusing. It could mean you cling too much to the past, and you ought to find a new path. But I think it's a good thing he's more important to you than that murderer. But remember, it's only my reading. The only one who can really understand you is you yourself. Breakfast is on the table, and I've got something else for you too. Come along, and we must save Ma from the clutches of his lordship.
So this is the point where you pick your first perks. Charming Man is a good one. Even if you go criminal, it helps you recover your reputation faster. Money is important early on, especially with our house rules, and Silver Tongue will help us get more money for every sale. Brewing those chamomile decoctions gave me the Lab Dweller hidden perk. And I picked the Enthusiast perk because it means that Henry doesn't need to sleep to recover energy. We can use that time to brew more potions and recover energy at the same time. I also go for the perks that give you more potions per brew. And Potion Seller to make more profit from selling them. I always pick 7 League Boots because the sprint bonus is absolutely useful when I'm running away from enemies. Nightcap is a good one here because you can train your drinking skill without getting hungover. And Cushion will make it easier to read skill books, so it's good to pick it as early as possible. Pavlina wasn't wrong. Hans was seemingly back to his normal boisterous self.
I'm Sir Hans Capon of Lipa, Lord of Rata. That is, almost.
Almost a nobleman, sir?
It's, well, a little complicated. Basically, my father, God rest his soul, bequeathed his estates to me when I come of age.
Ah, what's complicated about that, sir?
Nothing. And everything. But the thing is, it's up to a bunch of nobles that my father appointed to decide when I'm of age.
You seem quite adult to me, sir.
Yeah, I should think so. But they keep dragging their heels about it. They'd have to meet up to decide. And it's either, oh, it's too far to travel, or some are on their last legs and they just don't want to do it. If things were normal, I could present my claim to the king and he'd confirm my adulthood. Only our king is being held captive in Austria by his own brother, and I'm still the almost Lord of Ratai.
Our king is locked up?
Yes. Sigismund had him abducted. Have you not heard of it? My word, what kind of backwater do you live in?
Well, right here, in the woods near Shelioth. Almost noble, sir.
Ah, yes, quite. Please excuse me. I meant no offence. It was, just a turn of phrase, so to speak. Literally. Look who's finally up! Henry! Come and join us! Good morning, Henry! You have no idea how glad I am to see you.
I'm glad to see you too.
But I'm afraid we don't have much time for storytelling right now. We came here on an important mission and we cannot afford to dally any longer. We have to get to Trosky as soon as we can.
I'll prepare a bit of food for you, for your journey.
Oh, Bajena, I don't know how to thank you for all this.
Ah, but I do. Once we've settled our business with von Bergov, I shall reward you as befits a knight. You have my word of honor.
We're very glad we met you, and we're obliged to you for your help and hospitality. God bless you.
And you too, sirs.
As Henry says, may God bless you for your generosity and your healing arts. And you have rightfully earned the gratitude of the House of Lipa for all time. If you should ever find yourself in need, the doors of Perkstein shall always be open to you.
Thank you, sir. Though, I'm not sure I could find the way to Perkstein.
And if you pay attention, it seems that there is something between the ladies of the forest and the village of Troskowitz.
Sorry for coming late, Ma. I got held up in Troskowitz.
Of all places. And it's not the first time.
I know, but I was going past and I thought I'd try to sell some baskets and ointments there. And I succeeded.
Emmerich won't be happy.
Then he shouldn't sell so dear. He charges nearly twice as much as we do, so it's no wonder folks buy from us. But I understand. Next time I'll come straight home, so you're not on your own so much. If anyone comes here again threatening you, I'll put them in their place with an arrow. That'll teach them to try it on with us.
Maybe it's a good thing you wasn't here. They'd catch you, and I dread to think what they'd do with you.
They'd never catch me. You know I can take down a hare on the run, and a man's an easier target.
True enough. You've got a steady hand and an eye like a hawk. Not like me. But you know how it is. The less fuss going on around here, the better for us. And if anything does happen, we've got Growler, and he won't leave us in the lurch.
True. That animal is God's gift. Time to do something useful. The days are long, but there's no end of work to do.
Aye. Thank you, Pavlena.
They want to share details, but there is clearly something there.
How come you live out here?
That's just the way it is. It's for me to know, and you to find out.
Ah. All right. I won't pry. How come you live here, and not in the village?
Oh, that's hard to explain. It's just the way things turned out. And Ma and... Look, that's our affair, and we won't talk about it. Sorry.
But that would be a matter for a different day. Trosky Castle awaited. It was time to get on with their mission.
Finally! Where do you keep dallying? Henry, don't provoke me.
Before we hit the road, there's something you should know. I have a hunch that one of that band that ambushed us at the pond was Istvan Toth.
Toth? Are you yanking my pizzle?
I know how it sounds, but I saw him. Believe me. I'd never mistake his ugly face after all that happened.
Toth is in Sigismund's service and is harassing his opponents. And Otto von Bergov is one of Sigismund's allies. So Toth's hardly going to attack his people.
I saw him, the bastard, and I'll get him.
Yes. We'll surely get him one day. And your sword, too, here. But I see you haven't wasted any time and found yourself a weapon to replace that sword. That's good. You never know when you might need it around here. Come on, let's get going. Your mind will turn to better things along the way. Open up! I bear an urgent message for your liege lord.
Unfortunately, they got a shitty welcome. Literally.
Fucking shit! Fuck! You fucking cunts!
So the only thing left was to regroup at the nearest village and formulate a strategy to somehow meet von Bergov.
So now what?
And of course Sir Hans couldn't restrain his arrogant demeanour. Never mind that they stank like beggars.
What do you take me for, wench? For someone who stinks like a badger.
Look, we've had a tough couple of days, so we'd like a bit of peace and quiet, a beer, and a bite to eat.
Just bring the best you have, and we'll settle later.
As the gentleman wishes.
Well, she's not far off. We look like a couple of beggars, and we stink even worse.
Audentes fortuna juvat.
Audentes fortuna juvat.
What is this stuff?
Hey, there's meat in that. And there's more than you gave me coin for. When you're finished, report for work.
But it seems that Lady Luck smiles in their stinking arses.
What is it?
It's that woman from the pond.
What are you waiting for? She can vouch for who we are.
Henry couldn't help but note that the tavern was abuzz about a wedding that was about to take place soon.
So, how are our bride and groom handling all the fuss?
My sister talks of nothing else. And Pa, too. Only the groom is a bit off.
How's that?
He's hardly shown his face at ours since the betrothal. And I hear he's not home at the fortress much either. He's always off God knows where in the woods.
He's enjoying his freedom while he still can. Afraid to ask a pass? How are the preparations going?
They're all flapping around like headless chickens and talking about nothing else.
Well, it's a big affair. Your sister, bailiff's daughter, young Simeon. There ain't been a big wedding like that as long as I can remember.
And there won't be another like it, believe me. I'd rather stay here away from all the fuss, so I don't have to haul firewood and polish benches and listen endlessly to what a great honor it is for our family.
Well, good health to you then. Have you invited the guests already?
Of course. They'll be coming from all over the county and further.
But you forgot to invite your old mates.
If it was up to me, friend, I'd invite the whole tavern. But it's my sister's wedding, and she wants only the cream of society. Even Lord von Berghoff himself is coming.
If his lordship has any time for merrymaking, there's outlaws riding roughshod all over. Some foreigners camping down by the pond.
I heard. There's danger everywhere here. But all the more reason to make merry and forget our troubles.
Not a chance. I've got that much work at the mill, I could use an extra pair of hands myself.
We're both fucked then. There's a shortage of men, and anyone that can work is working already.
There's a band of nomads camping nearby. I hear they're good at blacksmithing.
I don't want any tramps in my forge. Least of all some wizards. Don't you know what they say about them?
The same as they say about millers.
Bugger me. Exactly.
What do you mean?
You've got peace and quiet in that mill of yours, but I'm run off my feet. It's war, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants a sword. Since them hands of mine went missing with my goods,
They're all
I
flapping
have my
around
work
like
cut out
headless
trying to
chickens
keep up with
talking
the orders.
about nothing else.
Well,
You'd be surprised, blacksmith. I'm more work at the mill than I can handle myself.
Are you talking about milling, or your dodgy dealing?
And there won't be another like it, believe me.
Dealing with thieves.
I'd rather stay here away from all the fuss, so I don't have to haul firewood and polish benches and listen endlessly to what a great honor it is for our family.
Since we're friends, let me warn you. The bailiff has a noose ready with your name on it. So watch your step.
Why should I be worried? Like I say, I'm the very
My sister talks of nothing else.
Suit yourself, Crazel.
Only the groom.
Don't say I didn't warn you.
How's that?
He's not home at the fortress.
I reckon I've never had as
He's
much
always
work in
off
my life.
God knows where
What
in
is
the
it?
woods.
You forging horseshoes for the wedding guests?
No, I'm forging swords for Lord Semyon. You know the countryside ain't safe. Everyone wants to be armed up to the teeth.
Of course.
But how come
They'll be coming
Semyon
from
needs
all
so
over the
many
county
swords?
and further.
And he wants more supplies of flour from me, too.
If it was up to me, friend, I'd
think
invite
he
the
wanted
whole
to feed a whole
tavern.
regiment,
But
not
it's my
just some
sister's
wedding
wedding,
guests.
and she
Lord,
wants only the
banquets.
cream of society.
You know what
Even
they're like.
Lord von
Fill their
Thurioff
bellies,
himself.
and there'll be nothing left for
His
us.
lordship has
And it seems that the Lord of Semin isn't just stocking up on food, he's also asking for swords. That struck Henry as very odd. He obviously knew firsthand about the banditry in this county, but surely a minor lord didn't have enough men to warrant so many swords. But there were more pressing matters at hand.
Nobody invited me. I know where I'm not wanted.
What was
I could
that?
get in through my uncle. He works in Semin's.
Oh, hi. Poor Captain Thomas might never get back on his feet.
I reckon they won't
Him and his men were attacked by bandits.
You know I'm not
Most
one
of them
for
are dead.
wine.
Lord von Berghoff is beside himself and won't
can't
allow his
wait.
soldiers out the
I hope my
castle.
uncle don't let me down.
So that's why they sent you for the wine. Wait a moment then. I'll be right back.
We saw each other by that pond.
What pond? I haven't been at any pond.
We saved you. You and some other women were attacked by bandits. You must remember that.
I have no idea what you're on about. I work at the castle and I wasn't at any pond.
And I have no idea why you're trying to deny it. A couple of the bandits grabbed you, but their leader put a stop to it. It was all very strange.
Shut up! For God's sake! Someone will hear you. I wasn't at the pond, and that's that. And don't mention it again. To me or anyone else. Got that?
Please, I don't know what's up with you, but I know you were there. I need your help. You owe me that much. But we need to get to von Berghoff, and you're the only one who can confirm who we are.
If you want to speak to him, the best place would be Semin's wedding.
Young Lord Semin, a nobleman, is marrying the local bailiff's daughter. It looks like von Berghoff will be there. It's invitation only, of course.
Oh, that's fantastic news, Henry. So all we have to do is get on the guest list.
Unfortunately, their food, no matter how poor it was, still had to be paid for. And the only thing they had was their sweat.
All we have to do is carry a few sacks of flour from that cart to the pantry. If we both do it, we'll be finished in no time.
Lug sacks? Are you yanking my noble pizzle?
I'm serious.
I can't work. I'm a noble. What if someone saw me?
It would be pointless to try and convince our noble companion to lower himself to manual labor. So Henry must do what has to be done by himself.
I'll carry them by myself.
I'm glad you know your place.
The bailiff's son is more than willing to boast about the wedding.
I need to pass on an important message to von Berghoff, but I can't get into the castle because of what happened to us.
Invite you? Not a chance.
But ultimately, it's the reddest of herrings.
Try asking for a job.
And the blacksmith and miller were indeed in need of workers.
I'm just an ordinary tradesman who minds his own business.
An ordinary tradesman, you say?
I'm looking for work, but mainly I'm a blacksmith.
If you're not talking shit and you can wield a hammer, we'll shake on it. And if you prove your worth, I'll even take you to that wedding.
Why would you work at a forge? Come and work for me at the mill. It's a cleaner job, and easier. And I can get you to that wedding too.
Oof, that isn't half heavy.
This was indeed good news. Once they paid for their gruel, they could easily find paying work. Even if it was likely that Henry would be the only one working. So things were hopeful. But of course, one Sir Hans Capon couldn't leave well alone.
And none of the strangers survived.
That was our company. But the two of us managed to get away. It was the same bandits who attacked Lord von Berghoff's men. Why the fuck doesn't anyone believe us?
Maybe because you've got no way of proving it.
We lost everything. How hard is that to understand?
What if you're one of those bandits? And you're up to no good? We should kick both of you out, just to be on the safe side. What's your name again?
Hans Capon of Perkstein.
I'm a bit peckish. You just made that up.
I certainly did not.
Yes, you did. I never heard of any Perkstein in all my years.
I'm not surprised. You're just a village yokel.
How dare you? I'm the son of the bailiff.
Ugh.
You ain't got no proof to back up what you say.
Proof? You want proof?
Aye.
Right. Listen to this. Ei incumbit probatio, qui dicit non qui negat.
Is that supposed to be Latin?
Clever you. Do you know what it means?
It's a nice place to rest
No.
when you're passing by.
And I doubt you do either.
The burden of proof is on the one who declares, not on the one who denies. So you see, I speak Latin. I've just proven to you that I'm a nobleman.
You've proved fuck all. Remembering some words you heard in church doesn't make you a nobleman.
And fell off. Nothing happened to the noble.
Ignore those people. We don't need any more problems. Don't let them provoke you, all right?
I'm perfectly calm. Some local wretches can't unsettle me. Keep working and take no notice of me.
You know what? I've had enough of your bullocks. Sit down and shut your mouth, or I'll shut it for you.
Just try it, you worm. Just try it.
I might just do that.
You're just
Here you
an
go.
idiot, a stupid, ignorant village yokel.
Hey, your insults are starting to fucking annoy me.
Oh, yeah? Well, you've been annoying me the whole time.
He comes here from God knows where, talks out of his ass, and is then rude to boot?
I'll have you all horsewhipped for this one day, you curs!
You should be careful you don't get a beating first.
I'd expect you to be more sympathetic towards people who've been ambushed when you've got so many bandits and other rabble here.
We are sympathetic, but you're no nobleman, just an ordinary big mouth.
How can you say that, you numbskull? I keep telling you we lost everything.
Would a sensible nobleman set up camp in such a stupid place? Somewhere by a pond? Out in the open?
What do you know about it?
More than you, judging by the shit you talk.
Damned insolence.
Hans, don't fuck this up. Me? Fuck what up? Don't let them provoke you. So of course Hans did just that.
Everyone knows it's dangerous around Trosky. Making camp in such an unprotected place is suicide. Only a fool would do that.
Stop insulting our dead companions.
You think I'm gonna fall for that cock and bull story?
Pack it in, Henry. There's no point in arguing with this yokel. He fancies himself as a military strategist.
I don't believe a word you're saying. A weed like you surviving a fight against bandits even von Berghoff himself has trouble with?
I'm willing to overlook all your insults if you apologize right now. And invite me to that wedding.
Did you hear what that lying nobody wants?
I am Sir Hans Capon, Lord of Perkstein, and I demand your immediate apology.
I am Sir Hans Capon, Lord of Perkstein. Sir Hans Capon, Lord of Perkstein.
It looks like I'm going to have to teach you a lesson.
There's no point in this. Let's leave.
I'd do what your pal says if I were you.
Get ready to pick up your broken teeth with broken fingers.
Oh! Good!
Get the fuck!
Nice!
Wicked! Take that fucker out, damn it!
What the hell is going on here? Grab them vagabonds!
Bastards! This will cost you dearly. Keep your mouth shut and don't make it worse. What? You behave like a spoilt brat. How dare you speak... You know, if you just shut up and done some work, we'd have coin by now and be on our way to the castle, but no, not his lordship.
You've got a nerve.
If you hadn't have played the hero, we'd have been there long since and I wouldn't have had to get you out of that mess. Oh yeah, because this isn't a mess, is it? Fuck off.
Shut up, or you'll get a whipping too.
Just who the hell do you think you are?
Henry tried to bite his tongue, because blaming your betters rarely goes well.
It's your fault we're in this fucking pillory.
Even if it is their fault.
I was just defending you.
But unfortunately, the same didn't apply to Sir Hans, and he had no compunctions about blaming Henry.
I'd expect my right-hand man to argue my case a bit better.
What do you think I was trying to do? We should have made ourselves scarce. None of that would have happened.
Oh, aye. Typical you, running away like a coward. If it hadn't been for me, we wouldn't have even been in that tavern. We've been in the shit right from the start because you had to play at being the knight in shining underwear, saving damsels in distress.
I don't believe it. You're trying to put the blame on me? Just like that?
Who else is to blame? You're just a simple peasant who has no idea how the world works.
Hey, let's just stop all this arguing. It'll just make things worse.
Fuck you. I've had it up to here with you. With you and your pontificating. You were supposed to make sure nothing went wrong. And how did that turn out? It was me who had to save your life. You're fucking useless. You couldn't even keep an eye on your own mutt.
Oh, that's enough. This isn't getting us anywhere. I understand you're downcast after all that happened to us. And I understand you need to take it out on someone. I can take it. But we shouldn't forget we have a job to do. And do it we must. Together.
That's exactly what I'm doubting. Everything goes to shit when you're by my side.
You don't really mean that. Calm down.
I'm perfectly calm. That's it. My life went to shit from the first moment I met you. And I've only just realised it. You're like a ball and chain. And I'd have bagged that wild boar too if it weren't for you.
Well...
And none of the rest would have happened. I wouldn't have been showered in shit.
Oh, come on, Capon.
Don't you cape on me. Not another word. I have to consider what to do next.
Right, ladies. Time to go home. But I swear to Christ, if I catch you again, I'm gonna skin you both alive. Go on, get out of my sight.
What are we gonna do? You can do as you like. You can go and carry sacks or dig latrines. I'll look after myself. I'll go and see Lord von Berghoff at the wedding. I bid you farewell.
Alright. Yeah. If I were in your shoes, I'd be glad to be rid of the good-for-nothing, eh? Yeah. Alright, off you go.
Suppose I really do need to find some job. I'll find mutt without you, you stuck-up Lord of Perkstein.
Hey, over here. Well, come on. I don't bite. Do you have anywhere to go? Somewhere to sleep? Are you going to just stand here like a statue? You've got time, right?
What do you want from me?
Yes, Henry was at such a low point that even literal beggars were feeling sorry for him.
For what?
I've been begging for alms here for days, but I didn't make any real coin till today. And that's thanks to you. The scene you made brought out nearly all of Troskowitz.
You're welcome. At least it was good for something.
At least he still had the clothes on his back and the rest of his meager possessions. And so the great Henry of Skallitz, Master Huntsman of Tamburg, Bailiff of Troskowitz, and bastard son of nobility found himself once again with nowhere to sleep and nothing but the rags on his back for comfort. But he did still have the tongue in his mouth and his wits, even if it did seem that his brain was missing, which was a concern, but nothing that Henry had not dealt with before.